Arnold from Packetworks. Cipher Analytics is based out of India, and we have Arnold based out of the Philippines.
Hello.
Yeah, so just give me a second while I bring up the slideshow. So meanwhile, while I bring up the slideshow, I just wanted to talk about a few housekeeping items. The first one is that if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat. And what I will do is I will be monitoring the chat, and I will. If you have any questions for me personally or to the panel, or to Chandni or to Arnold, you can ask those questions, and then I will relay them to the respective speakers, or we can answer them as a panel. And what we'll do is we'll run through a few slides, then we will have a Q&A and about the experiences that Chandni and Arnold have, and me as well. And what we'll do is we'll keep it interactive, as in so typically what we have done is the presentation is actually divided into three or four parts. The first part is what are the challenges of hiring an early team, and how do you kind of address those. The second part is how much to build and what to build, right? Like that is always a challenge once you have a team in place. And once you built the initial product, how much, how do you motivate the team, and what are the kind of challenges that you have to have with evolving the team structure, the architecture. We'll talk about some of those points, and in each of these, what we'll do is we'll have a couple of slides, and I will kind of go through my experiences. We'll put a bit of structure around it, and then we'll go back to um, Chandni and Arnold to get their views as well. So let me just share my screen. Just give me a second. Meanwhile, Chandni and Arnold, can you quickly introduce yourselves?
Yeah,
Chandni,
thanks,
you want to go first? Yeah.
Thanks, Vinayak. Hi, everyone. I am Chandni. I am the co-founder at Cipher Analytics. We are a media analytics company based, our flagship product is Reflection.ai, which is a deep tech video collaboration and analytics platform. We are based out of Pune, but we are headquartered in Singapore right now. Yeah, thanks, Vinayak.
Yes,
Arnold,
I'm
you next.
sure. I'm Arnold. I'm the founder of Packetworks. We provide LP1 connectivity, wireless connectivity in the Philippines, and at the same time, we design and develop and manufacture IoT low power devices.
Cool. Just give me a second to start the slideshow. Can you see my screen all right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
A second. Yeah. Cool. So quickly, this is the talk about building high performance team, and I'll quickly share a short introduction about myself. Just give me a second. This is a two-screen setup. Sometimes it takes a while to get going. Yeah, so I have a couple of decades of experience in technical leadership and individual contributor roles, and my areas of expertise are distributed systems, large-scale networks, data systems. And I have worked across a variety of sectors: networking, developer tools, ad tech, marketing tech, e-commerce, and smart mobility. And I worked at both large and small companies before working as CTO in essence in a global role at Microsoft for startups. I've worked at Akamai, which is a content delivery network, InMobi, which is India's first unicorn, and the last company that I worked, I was CTO at Zoomka, which is a smart mobility firm funded by Sequoia. Right. So that's a little bit about me and my background. So before we go on, let's kind of look at the one of the top reasons why startups fail, right? The one of the top reasons why startups fail is either there's no market need, you have not scoped out the market, or total addressable market is not proper, or there's not a good proper product market fit. The second one is, unfortunately, startups do run out of cash. Either they are not able to, raise funding, or they do not. If you are bootstrapped, they do not become cash positive, right? So these are the two most common things. But I think the next most important thing is they cannot either hire a right team in place, either as a co-founder possibly, or also if the early team, right, who actually builds up the initial product, the MVP, and once they have even a MVP, to scale to the next level, I think you need the right people in the team, right? Because as a early team, you have you have a vision which you're selling to investors, to employees, and not have the right team to execute that vision. I think this is one of the top reasons. So with that, let me just talk a little bit about my own experience regarding, how do we um, build an early team and what have been my learnings, and then we'll go to Chandni and Arnold to kind of understand their point of view also. So generally, what I found is that hiring journalists, who are kind of jack of all, master of some. So it has really worked for me. In fact, like you will see that some of the early startups actually do look for full stack developer, though I mean I personally believe full stack developer is a bit of a misnomer, because generally you are either really good at the back end and know a bit of front end, or really good at the front end and know a bit of back end. It's really rare to find somebody who's good at front end and back end, because they're so you need quite a bit of deep skill set for both. The second thing is, generally I feel that hiring for hunger and attitude and less for skill and talent, at least in initial stage, works really well, because you are iterating and finding out what is the right product to build, what is the right market to address, right? So if you so you don't in fact even know what is the talent or skill that you require. Like do you require a mobile app, or a web app will suffice, or will you be okay just having a progressive version of your web app? Will that work for you? So you don't know, and I think that is where I think specialization may not be like the top thing that you want. You want probably look at somebody who can actually figure these things out and iterate very fast. And hiring from diverse background helps, because I think this is probably preaching to the choir, especially to Chandni and Arnold, is that initially, if you give the same problem statement to two different teams, I think they'll come with two completely different solutions, and the quality of the solutions can either make or break product, right? Because even products are also in some sense a curation of features, and having people from different backgrounds gives you different points of view that you can look at. Finally, or rather, one of the other points is like, generally I find that keeping away people from who have a little bit of an entitlement, maybe in terms of, at least career growth or money, or, position in terms of titles, actually really helps, because at least in the initial stage, there's so many things that you want to figure out. All of these things do fall into place eventually. I'm not saying that is wrong, but in the initial team, while you are trying to figure out all of these things, I think this is one thing that you don't want to have in your team. And I think at least in the Indian context, I think it's important, or even especially I would kind of extend it to developing markets as well. And Arnold and Chandni can back me up on that. Is like you need a little bit of product thinking and curiosity, because that is extremely important as you're exploring the product space, right? And it's not just that you have to be a really good engineer or a really good salesman. But I think understanding the market and figuring out what kind of fits makes the sense, right? Because that is in some sense the time we are building up the secret sauce. Now let's move to the mechanics of actually hiring, right? Like generally what I found is like looking beyond a resume and finding passionate people generally works better, right? And where do you find passionate people, right? You can explore your own networks. You can look at the communities in the space or the stack that you're building in, or the domain that you're building in. This could be people who give talks. This could be people who are contributing to open source projects on GitHub, who have many side projects. You could look at that. And once in a while, yes, I mean, you will make mistakes, right? Because you are also learning, you are also on that journey. So in case you find that, somebody who is not up to the mark, especially in terms of attitude, right? I think you should be ready to let go, because that is something that I've seen like initial teams really hesitate, and that can really drag down, the energy in the team. Also, I've seen that one of the hallmarks that I have seen of founders or startups that have been really successful is the founders are extremely involved in the hiring in initial stage. And when I say initial stage, I'm not even saying that the first 30 or 40. I've seen founders who actually do interviews till they reach, I think, 250 people or so, right? Because getting that initial and team and kind of having that vision, propagating that vision in your team is like super important, right? So curating while you create the product and the features and a market, it's also important to curate and get the right people in the team, right? um, Last but not the least, actually, the first iteration of this presentation was done before the COVID crisis, right? So when I said remote workers, a lot of people were not ready to consider that, right? But I think now remote working is a thing, and people are more accepting, and we have all been in at home most of the time for the last 1 year. So I feel that considering remote workers actually expands your talent pool, especially for people who can work independently and specialist skill sets, right? As you grow, whether it's design or DevOps, or even some of the R&D work, you can actually have people who are working remotely. It helps if you work with them in the past or they come through strong referrals, because some bit of face-to-face is required, and you can fly them down. You can have them work with the team initially for a couple of weeks or a couple of months, depending on the context is. So they get ramped up, but I think after that they can work remotely. So with that, I just want to quickly go over to Chandni and Arnold to know what are your thoughts. What were the challenges when you built that early team? Maybe also some of the anti-patterns, some of the mistakes that you made. If you can talk about that. Chandni, do you want to go first?
Thanks, Vinay. So, most of the points that you have mentioned, they seem to be in line with what we have been experiencing. We are now 5 year old, and we have pivoted. We have had our challenges in scaling. The key challenge being that we were bootstrapped and we had a budget constraint, and we still knew that we had to get the best talent. We had to retain them. As you mentioned about the generalist roles, right? So in Cypher, we have the key roles that we have are those of the developers, those of the data science team. And in this case, I have two different views. So in case of developers, we had overlapping roles. We what we hired were full stacks. To be honest, I understand when you say that a front end and back end person has to be very deeply involved in either of the roles. But in our case, I think for a startup, I think it makes more sense that they know all the aspects of it. The DB, they have to be DP specialists. They have to have backend development and the UI part. So in our initial stages, we were looking for people who were ready to jump the gun and do all of these. On the contrary, for the data science team, what we did is we started initially with machine learning programs for our initial applications. But later, in the last 1.5, 2 years, when we doubled down on deep tech, our team was learning. They were learning the computer vision and speech models. But in this case specifically, I think more research. It is more research and experience oriented, right? So in the later half of 2020, we started scaling up. We were hiring experts specifically in who were experts in computer vision or in speech modeling. Then the other kind of roles that we have is data collection. Those are not high-end resources. We do not we segregate. We make clear what work is being given at each hiring stage, so there is no mismatch in the expectation and kind of work. So for all of these different roles, the key challenge is to ensure that obviously you get the right person. You have the hiring has to be on your gut of how much the person is hungry for an exciting role. Are they going to stay? Are they going to learn, contribute in the sense that you are expecting for a startup? It is very, very important when you're developing your products, you're scaling up. For us, so the other challenge we had is, so we have a lot of homegrown second line of developers right now. We hired fresh out of college, and they showed their hard work and interest for the company, and they have grown to that level. Whereas when we
let me quickly interrupt you here. So I think at least in India, right, like people are, I mean, I hear that all the time that we only hire from the IITs and we only hire from the IIMs, which are like the top tier. But I always like push startups to actually go and hire in the tier 2 or colleges which are not that well known, but I found that people are very hungry. And actually, after, I mean, at least since the last 10 years, I think because of the internet penetration, I found that, even people in tier 2, tier 3 colleges, because of the internet, you find a lot of really good self taught programmers. Did you find that is the case?
Absolutely, absolutely. So when we set up our office in Pune, we were targeting all tier twos in Maharashtra. Then we expanded to all tier twos in India. Most of our team, we do not have the we do not have from the premier institutes. Most of our team has are those self-taught. Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yeah.
we can hear you.
Sorry. So most of our team is hired from tier 2, tier 3 institutes from tier 2 colleges, but probably the cream from those, and where you know that they are very hungry to learn. They have always probably taken extra courses, kept up to mark, with everything that is happening. As far as you mentioned about the diversity, right? We initially had a very skewed ratio, gender-wise as well. And in the last 1 year, when everything went remote, when it was very easy to access talent, uh, honestly, it is very easy to access talent now when you are working remotely. The only thing you need is a good internet and the person being dedicated. Like, you don't have to push for and follow up. We, in fact, even ended up hiring someone in Africa. So all we are looking for is someone who's interested in working for us, and it doesn't have to be from a premier institute, to be honest. So, yeah.
Arnold, your thoughts?
Yeah, I totally agree with what you were saying. The issue with the main difference between a startup and an established company is, an established company has a process and protocols, whereas a startup, are fast moving, react to things really fast, but at the same time, they lack the processes, and these processes and checkpoints are addressed upon by the passionate outlook of your employees, and at the same time their hunger for getting ahead with things. And I also agree with Chandra with regard to balancing between budget and getting the right people. That's at the beginning when you establish a startup. You can't normally attract the best talents out there, and the reason for this is your brand isn't known, and you can't pay the high salaries that they're asking. And in this, we had a very good success in getting from colleges, new graduates. And this is actually goes into or supports what Vinayak is saying about entitlement. A lot of the experienced engineers and developers have grown already and are in management positions. And being in that position, normally a lot of times they don't want to touch code anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah. So a lot of times they don't want to touch code anymore, and in a startup, you need them to be hands-on, and this is a big challenge on things. So one of the other things that Vinayak has mentioned is, and one of the things that we sort of made a mistake early on, is that you never outsource your core competence, right? If you're in the software business, you don't outsource, software development. In our case, because IoT is a very broad subject, we had to address the network. At the beginning, the devices, the network, and to a certain extent, the platform. So these are hardware, infrastructure, and also software. And it's a very broad subject to address for us. So we decided to focus more on the hardware and the network. And but at the same time, we still have to have some kind of platform, because at the end of the day, IoT is about utilization of data. It's not about the devices or connectivity. It's the utility of the data that you get from the full IoT solution. So at the beginning, we had we made the mistake of outsourcing some of our development on the software side because we're not focusing on that. And the problem with that is the goals and objectives of a software developer as opposed to internal development is sort of different. The developer just wants to be done with the project, get paid, and move on. Whereas as a startup, you're not really quite sure. You make a lot of adjustments to your solution.
You have to be very agile. Yeah, I mean, because you have to keep on adjusting, right? Like as the market changes, and at least the initial customers also, I think the requirements keep on changing until you find that right kind of niche, right? Like or the
exactly.
I mean, some call it MVP, but I would say in some the minimum viable, I would say feature set is always tricky, and then that means that you have to refactor code a lot as well.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I just remembered something that, in terms of hiring, when, Chandni was talking about hiring remote. Interestingly, when I was working for a company based out of Pune, we actually hired from abroad. In fact, we hired somebody from Nepal, which is a neighboring country to India. And that person was actually had dropped out of college, but he was so good. We had to figure out, whether the labor restrictions are okay, because he was less than 18 when he joined the team. So it was very, very, very unusual kind of hire that made. And I've also hired people. Generally, also I found that sometimes founders are a little hesitant to hire people who are smarter than them or more experienced than them. And I tell them actually that is your number one criteria, right? I mean, you cannot know everything, right? You have so many blind spots. So you absolutely have to be comfortable with hiring people who are smarter than you and who have a strong point of view about how products should be built, because they will in some sense shape the product. And it's also great for those employees also because they feel that ownership with the product, right? So that is always a challenge, right? Because I've seen that, I'll be very honest here. Sometimes I find that founders can become a little insecure when they, find the people who are smarter than they want to hire them, but they kind of feel, like what will my role be, especially when they're investors and, that dynamics also comes into play. So I will stop this point here. I mean, there are a couple of questions, but I think those are related to customer centricity, which probably we'll be addressing in the later slides. So we'll take them a little later. So let me quickly move on to the next part of the presentation. Just give me a second. Right. So we talked about this a little bit, how much to build, right? This is a challenge. And now you have hired a team and you're building a product, how much to build? And one of the challenges is you have to build a minimal product to prove a thesis, better yet a high fidelity prototype. Nowadays, the tools are so good that you can click on buttons and it can show you a sample output and you don't need to know any code. So there are these like no code, low code tools which have become really, really good, which was not the case, I think, about 10 years back or even 5 years back, right? Which was challenging. You had to build a minimal prototype. And then I've seen some of the best founders actually use that to sell the concept, get a few customers, and then actually go and build a product, which is probably the right way to do. I'm sure that it may not work in every case. Like, for example, in Arnold's case, probably, you need the hardware. You can't, you need, even the MVP also does require a little bit of effort. But like in some other cases, like if it's a SaaS product, you can possibly do that. And especially I would say non-tech co-founders sometimes, or even tech co-founders, the mistake that they build is when they build features, I think every feature has a dual cost. The cost of building it is okay. I mean, it costs some effort, time, resources, but I think the cost of maintenance is really high. And when you build a bunch of features, sometimes they might actually interact in non-obvious ways, right? So the cost of maintenance actually grows exponentially, and that is something that you have to be really careful about. So you have to figure out how to layer the product and not just build for the early adopter, right? So there's this classic book called Crossing the Chasm, which I really hope I would have read when I built my first startup, because he actually fell in what is known as the chasm by Jeffrey Moore. So the basic thesis is that if you build a product for early adopters, you will at some point you will have to adopt it or adapt it for the mass audience. And if you cannot do that, I think you will just build a very niche product, right? And your total addressable market will be really small. The other one is when you build an MVP. Generally, the MVP is very scrappy. It's kind of put together. You have like cron jobs running at different places. It's basically put together by duct tape. I mean, people would say even about mature products, but like at least the early products, definitely some of them are put together by duct tape, right? So there's this great book. I mean, I'll have a references book at the end also. It says build one to throw away, right? So basically, at some point, you are going to have to rewrite your product, or at least significant parts of your product, right? I'm sure, like I can see that Chandni and Arnold are both nodding, so they have kind of been through that. And the challenge with that is that the second system effect, right? All the features you could not get in the first version, you want to cram them in the second version, and the second version becomes the rewrite becomes later and later, and that becomes problematic. Yeah, and I think this is something that Arnold already covered. Right? Don't outsource your product. I think this might be in some sense counterintuitive, but if tech is core to your product differentiation, it leads to problems later on, especially when you are scaling it. Because if at least you're not thought about scalability, you may not scale it, but if you're not thought about scalability, it becomes really problematic. And then the other challenge is either you over-engineer the product or under-engineer the product. So what is the right balance to achieve? Sometimes it's very not obvious, right? I mean, I mean, founders also have a tough time, right, to know what is the right, right feature set, the right market. And I have seen like extremely over-engineered products for what could have been done, very simply, or people actually doing things manually, also where they should have some automation. So you see both sides of the experimentation. And last but not the least, I think the thing that you have to think about is, how do you reduce the cost of experimentation, right? Because the more you experiment, I think the more kind of niches that you will find, and I think the more robust your product will be. But also, experiments do take time, effort, and resources, right? So, what is the right balance to strike, and how do you kind of reduce the cost of extension, especially if you are a platform? How do you kind of build an extension platform so other people can extend your product, so you don't have to do all of your development yourself? This is like a constant kind of tussle, right? So I'll stop here and maybe get views from, first maybe with Chandni and then with Arnold about your experiences on building the initial product. Especially Chandni, you mentioned in the earlier uh, session that you pivoted, right? So maybe talk a little bit about that.
Okay, yeah. So when I write, this is our third version of Reflection. The first one was very minimalistic. It was just an MVP. We took feedback from the industry experts. We had to change the tech stack to make it highly scalable. We are actually rewriting the code for the third time. So what we did is we needed to know the business problem first. So we took shortcuts in terms of performance. So we were running a small beta. We created shorter parts of the application, but by the time, the best application technologies within the application in terms of performance and scalability, the team has been reworking on that, and our latest product is obviously way upgraded. So you are right, we have to always start with the MVP. It comes with a cost to upgrade. What we learned is that uh, it comes with a cost, and in our case we had earlier done a monolithic architecture, right? So we needed less people to develop and manage it, but going forward we needed, so we have already pivoted to microservices. We have 12 microservices. So in this case, even though we know so we had to do a cost benefit analysis and also to go forward in the better direction. So in our third version we are highly performance oriented right now. Now, we did see the entire value chain in media and entertainment. We thought of all the potential clients, and what we could make for everyone. Like you said, the total addressable market needs to, like obviously we need to maximize that. So even though we would be targeting the early adopters, but we've tried to keep in mind, if all the other people that we would be targeting in the next 1 year, probably as per growth strategy. So we've not shied away by actually giving away test versions to even individual content creators or smaller post production agencies in our case. However, we had initially started the development in mind, keeping in mind the broadcasters. So yeah, the addressable market also has been a realization based on all the market service that we have done, the various initial versions of the product that we have presented to the industry experts. So I think you're absolutely right that we have to take the conscious call. We have to probably build it in parts. It is absolutely connected by the tapes, by the duct tapes. That is absolutely true. But for a startup, I mean, going like now we take conscious calls. You know, if a client is asking for any other uh, module in the product, we have to think of the time, the effort, the cost that is going to go into it. We may park it, because sometimes you have to park it so that you can go to the market initially and get some traction. So we have all of those situations where we need to have a product go to market, go to the investors, while not having all while just creating microservices which we can distribute. Also, as you said, we are also preparing APIs which could integrate with different applications, so that the reach is higher, so that we
People
can.
can build up your product as a platform. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So yeah, that's how our journey is on the product creation. We have been rewriting the code as many times as possible, and we may again, because as far as it goes, the product has to keep getting better, and I'm sure the clients would also be more than happy to that have it that
Yeah.
way. Yeah.
Arnold, your thoughts?
Yeah, with regard to MVP, you're completely right. I completely agree with you with having an MVP as early as possible. And what's critical is actually getting the MVP out there, so you can get feedback from. Again, let me emphasize this: friendly clients. That's very important, because
Very important, yeah.
if you don't, yeah, if you try to do your MVP as perfect as possible, it might not be the right fit for the market, and you don't want to find that out after investing a lot of time in doing your MVP. So getting the product out there and testing it against a friendly client or friendly clients is critical. So you can get feedbacks on what you need to change and improve on your product.
Absolutely. I mean, great point. I mean, yeah, I mean, friendly clients is super important, right? I mean, especially friendly clients who can give you great feedback. And I think just as we talked about hiring, I think recruiting the right customers initially also is super critical. And again, that can make or break. I mean, because that will influence your product roadmap and your product design as well.
And the other thing that I wanted to add is making sure that you differentiate between nice to have and need to have. A lot of the products out there that are coming out are it's great in terms of concept, but when you push it out to the market, you find out that yeah, that is nice, but we have these other needs. Before we do this thing, we want to do these stuff first. So a lot of times we fall in love with our product and our solution to the point wherein we lose sight of the market. So getting interaction with the market also grounds you to what the market needs. So
Yeah. Great point, right? I mean, I like to use a terminology. I would say neutralizers and differentiators. Right? Neutralizers, in some sense, would be like the table stakes, right? Like what the market has or what the market expects, even if you're in a new market. So the bare minimum, right? That is a neutralizer, I would say. And I would say the differentiator is what keeps people hooked, and what differentiates a product either in the market from the other competitors, right? Right? Kind of figuring out where your feature fits in that kind of spectrum is like super important. Also, one interesting thing or analogy that I saw was the ship of Theseus, right? For those who do not know the ship of Theseus, it's a very interesting concept. So let's say if you have a ship that is actually sailing, and some parts of the ship are built of wood and it's rotting. So you replace the parts of the ship, the rotten parts one by one. I mean, let's say after a few years, you have replaced all of the rotten parts, and the ship is completely new, or is it really completely new, right? Is it the same ship, right? Because now you've replaced the parts one by one, right? And generally, when people go in for rewrites, I tell them don't use like the complete rewrite from scratch. Use the ship of Theseus approach, right? Take out one part, write a microservice, or break it into smaller parts, right? May not be a microservice, but break it into smaller parts, smaller modules, right? So what happens over a period of time is that the ship of Theseus is because of the way you curate features, because of the way you curate code. Sometimes you might change your programming stack as well. Is that your product after 3 years would be completely different from a technology point of view than what you started with, but there is a continuity, right? But I've seen startups fail so much by trying to do the rewrite because of what we talked about, the second system effect is that have that rewrite and then you constantly they are either porting features or making it compatible with the non-documented features, and that becomes a problem, right? So I use this analogy, the ship of Theseus, a lot, at least in the startups that talk. So with that, let me quickly move on to the next part. Let me share my slides again, and yeah, and maybe after this iteration we'll take a few questions from the audience as well. Just give me a second. Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Yes, Vinayak.
Yeah. So I think now you have a team. You have built the initial product. So now so now how do you motivate your team, right? How do you how do you make sure you do not have vanity metrics, right? Vanity metrics are like number of bugs solved, a number of features, maybe some other probably technical metric, right? And there is very interesting concept of Goodhart's law, right? When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. A great example I read sometime back was this metric which IBM had in one of their products. They said, hey, we will measure the developers or rather the team by the number of bug fixes that happened. And while it worked for a while, what the team realized, both the testing team and the developer team, is they colluded, right? So the developers actually created bugs, the testing team caught them, and they were just kind of playing this game constantly, where somebody was creating a non-existing bug and they were kind of fixing it. So the bug count actually and bug fix count actually increased, but the product did not improve. So basically, what happened was that people were gaming the system, right? And that's why I think this Goodhart's law actually comes into place. The other thing I would say is invest in good tools, documentation, hardware, and upskilling. While this seems very obvious, I've seen a lot of startups. Again, I know startups are also hard-strapped for resources, but I think investing in this actually gives you a huge advantage in terms of productivity, right? Because the number one thing you're trying to optimize, at least in a tech-oriented startup, is your program or your developer or product bandwidth, or product engineering bandwidth, I would say. And anything that kind of gives you more bang for the buck actually can have a huge impact on your product. And I think the initial focus should be on having communicating properly and building trust. Because if two teams do not trust each other, you will see that things fail often, or they do not communicate properly, or you will see incidents happen in the field. And I'll go a little bit deeper into this as in the next slide. And before I go there, I think the other thing is also when you're motivating the team, I think the number one question that comes up is what is a growth path? So the typically growth path for especially growth stage startups is, once you have kind of built the initial product going, is you can have a tech ladder in which somebody can be an individual contributor, grow to be a architect or a senior developer or a principal principal developer, or you could have engineering manager ladder, it says engineering ladder, but it's engineering management ladder. And he or she could manage people. They could manage people. And finally, some of the engineering folks can actually go into product because they have an interest in actually understanding the market, understanding the users, understanding how products can be composed, how they can actually be built, right? So these are the three ladders that I would highly suggest, especially for growth stage startups. Especially once you kind of cross 30, 35 is I think when you start kind of hitting this kind of stage. Again, beware of, I mean, there's, sorry for the profanity, but beware of the brilliant asshole. Typically, you will have somebody on the team who's really, really good at contributing, but who's he or she is extremely toxic. Typically, a he, and that brings down the energy, the morale of the team, right? And but typically, I've seen founders or teams keep them on because they are really good in either delivering or fixing bugs, but in the long run, the harm to the team is irreparable. The other thing I found is that if you push your team to the front line, like let them on the field trips, sales calls, customer support, that really helps. So a great example was from my own career is when we were building a product in my last startup, which was a smart mobility. We were building a product where you could actually rent cycles and by the hour, and then kind of put them back into this cells, or rather starting and ending points, and they were kind of fixed geofence locations. And the operations team would constantly tell us saying that, hey, either you need to give us the ability to actually reduce the size of the geofenced area, because what people would do is they would actually get into the geofenced area, and then they would actually be able to actually lock or unlock the bicycle, right? But if the area is really large, the cycles would be scattered over a larger area, and people would not be able to find a discovery of the cycles for unlocking would become a big problem. So I tried telling my team that this is important, but what we did is we took them on a field trip, and they realized there was a this was in Pune, and there was a place, college, where we had one of our locations, geofence locations, where you could pick up and drop cycles, and it was actually a playing ground. And what we realized is on the app we could see that there were 6 or 7 cycles, but when we actually went to the underground, because the geofence area was large, we had the ground was pretty large, and you had cycles all around the ground, and it was really hard to actually go and find the cycles, especially if there was like some kind of a sports game going on. So as soon as the team saw that, I think the product got fixed, right? So even simple insights or simple understanding because of this field trip actually helps. And similarly, when customers talk and talk, especially if you have a B2C product or even a B2B product, if they talk to customers, they realize what is actually the pain point, because developers have a conception of the world, and when it actually meets the real world, you will always see that there is a small gap in perception. Closing that gap becomes really important, which is where I said that engineering excellence is good, but if you have product thinking, then actually you can create magic, right? I think this is like the secret sauce. And also, I think as you grow, having a small R&D budget for experimental changes really helps. It motivates the team, either using a new language or using a new tool or using a new framework. It can actually set the team on a very good trajectory. So having that small R&D budget, and that budget could be in terms of time, in terms of money, and also it could be in terms of putting together a small team. Last but not the least, which kind of follows from the earlier point, is good engineers value independence, but do it in moderation. Why I'm saying in moderation is because, let's say somebody is really passionate about a language, that's great, but actually incorporating that language, let's say, into the stack, there are so many other parameters, training the rest of the team, maintaining their product. Every language has its pros and cons. So to kind of think through it, right? So while independence is good, you don't want to have a stack in which every microservice, like you have like 10 microservices, but they're written in like 5 languages. So what happens when something fails in production? Because one person cannot be good at 5 languages. Probably they're good at maybe 2. If they are really good, maybe at 3, but 5 is a little bit of a stretch, right? So I think there is these things have to be done in moderation. So before we go on to team structures, I just wanted to quickly, cycle back to our panel and have their thoughts on what are the challenges they face. Like once they had built the initial product, in motivating their team, in growing the team. Maybe Arnold, do you want to go first and talk
Sure.
about your challenges, especially because hardware is a really hard industry. Anything that involves hardware has a longer iteration cycle as compared to software, or even in software, don't have to ship software in golden CDs anymore. I think Arnold, you're also old enough to know that the software was actually shipped on CDs. I think nowadays everybody downloads the software, or you even have SaaS, right? We talk about CI/CD, but CI/CD was a dream, like 15, 20 years back. I think. But yeah, so yeah, with that, I just want to have your thoughts on, what were your
Sure.
challenges motivating your team as such.
Yeah, Vinayak, it's not these. I started with Windows 3.1, so those are in like I think 11 or 13 floppy disks. So I'm not sure whether people still know what a floppy disk is. But anyway, you mentioned earlier.
It's the save icon in the word, right? That's what I saw a joke where somebody said, kid is saying to his father, saying that I have a physical version of the save icon in the word, right? And yeah.
Yes.
Yeah,
So
but
so
interesting. Yeah.
yeah, we're talking about motivation and circling back to what you said earlier about passion. You're looking for people who have passion about what you're doing, right? Not just not just engineering brilliance. The other thing that so passion is actually you can't expect it to be always there. As a founder, one of your primary roles is to really impart passion to your team. You're the ones expected to be most passionate about what you're doing because it's your baby, right? But at the same time, you need to be able to communicate this constantly to your team, because otherwise they lose sight. They get demotivated about what they're doing, because let's face it. In a startup, a lot of the people are underpaid, overworked, and often subjected to really tight timelines, right? Communicating your passion, the broad strokes, what you're really there for is critical in terms of motivating your people. And then one of the other things is, you don't just look for engineering brilliance as well. As you scale your team, you need to also take into account their communication skills, because even if they know how to do things, if they cannot disseminate that to additional hires that you will be having as you grow your team, it's going to be hard to transition from a small team to a larger team.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Lastly, one of the things that you talked about is getting the engineers or your team exposed to the client, right? That's one of the things that we sort of engineers and techies sort of miss out. We're all doing this so that the client would be satisfied with what we're doing. Without the clients, no matter how good your product is, it won't go anywhere. At the end of the day, you need to be able to identify the client needs, and this means not only the sales department, but also communicating that to the engineers, so they see the goal that the goal for what they're doing. They're not developing things and items just for themselves. It's for the client. So that thought should never be lost.
Chani, do you want to chime in with your experience?
Sure, Vinayak. So, absolutely motivating the team, especially as they scale in a startup, overworked, underpaid, is a challenge. But what we have actually from our experience is that the people who are hungry, the people who stay, they do it because there is a huge amount of learning curve. They are willing to stretch, and we do take help, a lot of external help from people who have tons of experience, including you and I, including all the people that have been introduced through the bootcamp. So they know that they are ahead in the league. They know they have more experience and knowledge than their peers. So that probably could be one thing that keeps them going. I think they are very intrigued by newer technologies. I'm very proud of my team for that. We make sure that they are part of most critical calls with the clients. So the core team at least is absolutely conversant with the business problem that we are solving. We get good inputs from them. So sometimes it's easy because we have to be agile. We probably skip the documentation step of where there's a BA who will write all the requirement, and then the team is supposed to have the translation of requirement before the development. So since we are all involved from the start, it makes it very easy for us. So that is, I think, one thing that keeps them going. They know the scope of there is no limit, right? So they know that here we will take care of that. We As far as you mentioned about the metrics, uh, healthy competition, I think, is necessary. It should not be counterproductive. It should not hamper relationships, of course, but it's good to keep them on their toes. Uh, Other than that, we do offer. We tell them that if there's anything else that you want to learn, you could just sign up for training courses on Coursera or Udemy. And however, Karan and I, as co-founders, believe that more than the academic training that they can do, they should also have for more practical training. It's, I think, more productive. The core team, who are now the second line of the company, they are actually the backbone. They have triggered a lot of change processes based on these inputs from various external consultants. So now they see things with a different lens. That cannot be taught in the classroom, right? So gradually we have so these are a few things we do to motivate them. Now that we are close to 100 people in the team, it is practically possible for Karan and me to be involved in every hiring. I know it's very difficult to let ourselves outside, but what we've done is we have decentralized. It is more scalable. We have assigned the budget for a few resources that would be an extension of the core team. We let them take some calls. As you said, independence, yes, but in limit. That comes, I think, most importantly when we take any architectural change calls. We do have deeper discussions with pros and cons, but we are most welcome to suggestions. So I think the key point to take here is that for startups, it is an extremely different experience. We tried hiring people from larger MNCs, but we realized that there are two difficulties, right? Uh, their experience is not up to mark for the number of years we feel, and still there is a sense of entitlement. So it is very difficult to be on the same page. Even though we do not like firing people, we are on thin ice with the budget. We have to have those conversations sometimes, and we've been fortunate. We Instead of actually getting to the stage of firing them, a couple of them we wouldn't have wanted have stepped down themselves. But I understand when you say that as you scale, you have to take those tough calls, and yeah, we're learning as we grow. So that's from
No,
my side.
especially especially in the specialist positions, right? As you grow, I think hiring for that position and actually making, because as a team you do not have that expertise to even evaluate, right? So I think you made an important point which I wanted to kind of highlight, which was having that ring of advisors, right, to kind of grow your team. So what has been like useful to me, actually it's not in the presentation, but I think it's a great point, is that you can't be the mentor for all your team, right? So having that external group of mentors who can actually grow in different direction, right? Especially I think for a complex product like Arnold is bringing, that there's hardware, there's software, there's so many different aspects to it. Even as a founder, you have limitation both in terms of knowledge, in terms of time. to gain that expertise. So even getting the team to talk to specific people has been really useful. And again, like, maybe this is a plug for Microsoft for Startups. We actually do try to provide that to a startup, because I think that is, in some sense, you might have blind spots which you're not even aware of, right? And not as an individual, as a founder, but also as a team. And I think talking to the external experts actually stimulates your understanding to look at that. So having that ring of advisors has been, like, personally also has been very invaluable, right? Because as you grow, right, many times you are young and as a founder, and you're not experienced some of the situations which maybe some other experienced people have seen many times, right? Like, for example, I mean, somebody like Arnold has probably seen like the second system effect, right? So he's done so many rewrites, like, so maybe he may not know the concept of the ship of Theseus, but he has done it himself so many times that he absolutely understands it viscerally, right? But maybe somebody like you, who's probably done it like maybe not very long, you hit it, right? And then you are like, how do I kind of approach this? And kind of building on the experience of the others really helps. So I think one of the questions I'll quickly take is like, how do you, and we addressed it to some extent, but from Anandas is, how do you have strong customer centric product thinking so that the product has sustained relevance over time? Often, as we scale the team, it gets lost. Any tips on achieving this? I mean, I have personally talked a couple of things like field trips, customer calls, sales calls, pre-sales. This helps. Anything else that you want to add, Chandni and Arnav?
To me, a lot of customer engagements is critical. Oftentimes, when we speak to a client, we involve also an engineer with us. So that way they get exposed to the real issues on the field. But at the end of the day, a lot of this falls onto the founder or the core team, being able to you want your engineers to focus on what they're doing, but at the same time, it's up to you, the founders and the core team, to be able to communicate what's happening externally to your internal team. So having perhaps
that balance is important.
Exactly. Yes.
Shani, do you want to add anything?
No, I think I think it is important to have regular communications, have those ticket management systems in place. But you're not a service company, right? So you know that while you are developing the product, you have already done your research, and there will be longer phases before there are updates. So as long as there is a point of contact who can ensure that the communication between the internal and external is good, and there are no and you're available for immediate fixes, I think you're customer centric. I think that's the basic that the client needs. So yeah.
Cool. With that, I think probably I'll move to what is, so we're just conscious of time. So we are almost an hour, and this has been an interesting discussion. But towards the last structure as we grow is the team structure. So let me just quickly share the slides again. Just let me know when you can see my slides. Cool. So yeah, I think the last part that we'll probably address is regarding team structure. Hello. Can you get to see? Cool. I guess. Okay, cool. So yeah, so Conway's law, right? Like any organization, and you can Google this, so I won't go into deep into this, but any organization that designs a system defined broadly will produce a design whose structure is a copy of the organization's communication structure, right? For example, let's say what that means is, let's say you are building a marketplace and you have a demand side, right, where the money comes from and and consumes your product, and then you have a publisher side or the supply side, which kind of supplies the product, right? Like for example, in the ad tech world, it could be a publisher or a website that provides the supply, and then the ad network kind of sits in between, and then you're on the demand side, you have the advertisers who actually put in money into the system and creatives in the system to actually reach the audience, right? Or it could be like something like Uber, right? You have on one side you have the supply, which is drivers and vehicles, and on the other side you have the demand side, right? Which is possibly the people who are actually taking the rides. If you have, let's say, these two teams and which kind of address these two problems, they will, for example, communicate only via APIs, right? And the API structure will kind of define the communication pattern and the interface and the protocols between the teams, right? So that is what this conveys laws means. And as the structure gets more complex, as your system changes, as your communication, as your team changes, the communication patterns and the team change, that will get reflected in the architecture, right? And some of the rules of thumbs is like, a good time to so typical question comes in like, what is a good time to evaluate team structure when the team size reaches 15, 30, 60, 100? All right, these are probably, I think, say rough sizes when you actually look at evaluate the team structure, because these are the points at which you either hive up teams or make them more efficient by kind of clustering similar kind of concerns together. And also the other places, like when new products are built or you pivot, right? Or you build a new product line, you did not necessarily pivot, but you say, hey, this product is kind of running on its own and it just needs to be maintained with very, very minimal feature development, but I need to kind of attack an adjacent market to make my initial product better, right? So you pivot or build new products. And finally, I would say when engineering time is used suboptimally, a good example of this is, let's say you have a product, either typically a platform, it could be a data platform, it could be an IoT platform, or it could be any other platform in which like which is kind of the corollary we said, like most that engineers are interacting too much with the client. Or they're spending too much time actually integrating and customizing the product for the client. And they're not spending as much time maybe developing the core product, right? So maybe that is a sign that you might either need to have customer engineering team that does specific extensions for the customer, and your core product team that actually focuses on the core product. Another good example is, as a team grows, they might use these common services or common platforms. And everybody is kind of building their own version. Every team is kind of building its own version. It could be like serialization, deserialization protocols. It could be the way storage is used. It could be the way certain metadata is managed. It could be the way reports are generated. And what happens is that you might actually have to build a platform team that abstracts all of this. So this is an internal team whose customers are the rest of the engineering team, right? So this could be another example in which the engineering or dev time is suboptimally, or there is replication. And also inherent to the structure of the team, there can be conflicts, right? Because they look at different views of the problem, right? Of the problem space. And typical kind of conflict points between teams I would kind of address. One is that between product and engineering is that product wants to build something, but they do not know how much bandwidth engineering it has, or how hard it is to build something, and that can lead to conflict because they feel that, okay, having this would really help the customer, but engineering feels, so this is maybe not the right priority now because our own internal product and internal metrics like latency, stability are in question, so we need to address that. So this is a constant kind of I would say push and pull kind of scenario between engineer product. And if there's a lack of trust or lack of communication, it can go haywire pretty fast, and I have been in startups where some of these kind of relationships have been broken down, especially in high pressure situations, or like you have a sale, for example, in a B2C in which there's a lot of traffic, or there's a big enterprise client that is coming on board and there are shouting matches, right? Unfortunately, I've been part of those. Or it could happen between like dev and DevOps, right? For example, the dev is incentivized to build new features, and DevOps is incentivized to keep the current code running, right? So that can lead to conflict because DevOps will make it really, really hard to deploy code, and developers will want to make it easier and easier to experiment. And if there is a lack of communication, or sometimes, typically you would see that dev or Q are overworked because the teams might be small, and generally the number of developers might be large and the QA team is small, or the DevOps team is really small, or you do not have a right tooling. For example, you do not have proper logging, you do not have proper visibility in terms of observability, or you do not have good monitoring and alerting, right? So I've seen, like, unfortunately, I've seen really, really good products and customers who have built literally, single digit $1 million product, and did not have a DevOps team. And the only way they could find out about our problems when there was a when the customer complained. And I was like, I was asking the founder, like, why are you not livid? That, how can you live with this situation? Because you need to know what's happening in your product, or what, before it goes wrong and before the customer sees it. Because sometimes, things can go really wrong and you can actually lose the customer and also your reputation, right? It could be like a data breach, it could be like a prolonged downtime, and that becomes really problematic, right? So having the right team structure and the right incentives in place is very important. And as you specialize, right, as something that I think Chandni also kind of touched upon, right? As you grow, I think there's more specialization, right? You have a data engineering team, you have a data science team, your integration team, you have a product engineering team, you have a DevOps team. So how do you specialize? I think that is something that you need to figure out. And especially when initially that we give you the advice saying that talking about hire generalists, right? But when you specialize, how do you create a pathway for them? I think that is where the engineering ladders, which we talked in the earlier slide, becomes really important, right? And also, as a team grows, as you kind of split into smaller team, be sure that the product and engineering team are synced together, right? The product team and engineering team are like two, I would say, sides of the same coin, right? So if they do not go in tandem, like for example, you have one product manager who's managing three engineering teams, there are going to be problems. Or if it's the other way around, right? Like the three product managers, but one engineering team is kind of executing all of the features. So there will be some kind of dissonance there. So having like regular sprint cadence for features and roadmap discussions helps. Uh, One kind of non-intuitive things is like, especially if you plan to grow fast, getting a good recruiter or HR really helps, because some of the processes can be kind of done really early, and that can really a good recruiter. And I've been really fortunate to have had good internal recruiters who could kind of understood the problems that we were trying to solve, or the kind of people we were trying to hire, and getting that right recruiter in place really, really helps. And if you're kind of hiring fast, right? Like I think both Arnold and Chandni talked about hiring from colleges, right? Especially hire like maybe like 5 or 6 people. Consider doing a boot camp for them, maybe a week-long boot camp, sometimes a month-long boot camp, depending on how complex your product is, and have everybody, all the stakeholders, kind of talk to them, and so that will help the team get up to speed really, really fast. And last but not the least, having like a buddy system and pair programming maybe for new joinees. And when I say a buddy system, the buddy can actually help not only like in where to find documentation, whom to ask, but even things even things like where can I find how can I file my tax returns, or what is like the leave policy, even things like that. If they can help, that really helps. um, so I think before I go on, I think let me quickly talk to um, Chani and Arnold to get their viewpoints. So Arnold, again, do you want to go maybe quickly and talk about your experiences, and
Yeah.
then we'll take a couple of questions as well, which have been coming in.
Well, yeah. One of the things that I think isn't listed here is a span of control. That's very important. We oftentimes take it for granted, but according to the industry, as I was told, 1 to 8, up to 8 subordinates is the maximum you can have. So you have to be careful in terms of watching that, because a lot of times, if you assign fewer people to a certain person, you might be underutilizing the person. But at the same time, you don't want to overassign more people than the person can handle. So 1 to 8 is I think the common practice in the industry, and that's something that you have to watch out for. I think so. Yeah. I think we lost Vinayak. Oh, there he is.
Chandni, if you'd like to add something.
Thanks, Kabir. So, on the same lines, as Vinayak mentioned, we have to specialize as we grow. We realize that we need to hire a DevOps senior person, even though we have been taking external consultation, right? So there are some of the roles where you once you start growing and scaling, you need to fill up those positions. It cannot always be outsourced. That is one thing that is that absolutely hit for Cypher. Other than that, of course, keeping a boot camp, having a buddy system is what we have in place now. Right now, we have internal HR team who is day in and out recruiting because we are really scaling up. We have a lot of openings at any point in time. We had earlier not enough knowledge, right, about what was the latest. Way to go around managing teams internally. We had a lot of Azure boot camps where we realized following the Azure DevOps, having the pipeline and uploading code, and all the standard practices that come with it. So I think over time we have been reorganizing our structure, uh, having eight people to be managed. I think it's a very good point that Arnold has mentioned. We had a very flat structure earlier, but now we need to focus on other strategic things, and we have slightly moved to vertical. And however, anyone can still reach us, but it's practically impossible to manage 100 people. We try our best to have conversations and know what are the extreme lines of development or process changes that are being discussed, and then have regular communications around that. For example, we only moved to core when we knew that we had enough production and community support, which was only last year. As a startup, you have to take conscious calls and you know take those shots as they come. We were not ready for Kubernetes or any Docker earlier. In fact, we knew things that are happening in the industry and things that would have been the best practices, but it takes time. There's a cost to extension. So we never had a CI/CD pipeline or used DevOps probably 2 years back, but now it's basic for us. We've had support of Microsoft for startups absolutely in this journey, which came in just at the right time. We're almost 1.5 years into this program, and I think we could just pick up a call or schedule something with the entire team of ours and Vinayak to know where what our pathway should be or what issues should be there. How do we handle them? So yeah, that is how while we scale, we have been managing the technology and giving responsibility and accountability to our team members. They'll also learn from mistakes, right? So as long as it's not critical, as long as it's not on the live deployment, I think we can let them take learn as they go. So
Cool. Quickly, I wanted to make a plug because we talked about Azure DevOps. Actually, the next webinar that we'll have in this series, actually next Thursday, is on Azure DevOps, right? And we are going to talk about different types of different types of deployment. And just give me a second. I think I'm having a little bit of trouble with my laptop. You can hear me all right, right?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah. So Azure DevOps, you're going to have different types of deployment. What are the branching strategies? And go into in depth. Next week. So I would highly encourage everybody on this call to attend the next webinar as well. With that, actually, I just quickly wanted to take some questions from the audience. Julian Soon has actually asked a couple of interesting questions, right? How do you objectively measure a performance of an engineering team, and how do you do performance management of your engineering teams? Arnold, do you want to maybe quickly talk about your approach to this, the performance management and evaluating performance of the engineering team?
Yeah. developing hardware for IoT is sort of different from a lot of the hardware development out there, and the reason for this is devices for IoT are fairly simple. They're not as as complex as other hardware endeavors are. So normally, at our size, each project or each device is owned wholly by an engineer. So we do it in pairs. So we have a test engineer and we have a development engineer together developing the product. It usually takes us about 45 days. So we've had numerous experience and exposure into how much time it takes to integrate sensors to the radio part and to the MCU. So we have a fairly defined timeline in terms of developing products. So what we do is we just compare our engineers' performance based on previous objectives before. So again, it might not apply to other engineering endeavors or activities because I believe a lot of the engineering processes out there are more complex than what we're doing. But in our case, 45 days to develop a particular device. So we just compare the performance of the engineer at the end of that to what's established already.
Chandni, your thoughts?
Yeah, Vinayak. So in our case, since we've been absolutely engrossed in the product development, we take timelines from the internal team. The lead product engineers would have a set of internal timelines for the functionalities, and we have regular calls to understand the progress. Are there any challenges? Is it because of something that we could provide them extra, or is it something like genuinely getting stuck? Are the expectations wrong in terms of timeline or the functionalities? For the ones that are an extension of the second line, they have regular reviews. We check on what they have been learning additionally with us, and we give them a very constructive feedback. I think in our case, the entire evaluation is based on a day-to-day progress that is happening on the development of the product. So yeah.
Cool. So I think the last question, I think I'm just conscious of time before I talk about the last couple of slides and the recommendations because we just have about 10 minutes more. So Julian asked, is there a guidance on product to coder ratio? So personally, if I were to answer that question, generally I found anywhere between 1:4 to 1:6 or 7 generally works decently well. But again, it depends on what kind of product it is, what kind of expertise is needed. It's so specific to the engineering product and also the market, right? Just to give you an example, when I was working at Junka, which was a couple of years back, and I was a CTO running a large team, about 100 odd people, and we did everything from operations tools that we built internally for operations for we had a platform team, we had a data science team, and we had again the ratio in each of these teams was different, right? For example, something that was like more customer facing had a higher ratio, as in like we had more product managers for customer facing teams. For example, the interfaces like mobile apps and for example the web app and the progressive web app that we had. So we had a slightly higher ratio, but when it came to backend, actually some of the senior engineering folks actually played the role of product, though they were not product. So for example, let's say in inventory management or when it came to pricing, for example, we did not have a lot of people a lot of product management. We had a larger engineering team, but a lesser number of footprint in terms of product, because some of the engineering folks also play that. So it actually depends on the multitude of factors. Depends on the maturity of the team, how good they are, how good is their product thinking, how, and again, like, it's also factor of complexity of the product, complexity of the market. Yeah, so it's very hard, but generally I would say, like, between 1:4 to 1:7 is like a good ratio. Arnold and Chandni, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, it goes back to what I was saying earlier about spans of control. You have to be conscious about the maximum number of people a manager can manage. So assigning too few people would make your manager productivity lower. And if you assign a lot of people to that manager, then you undermine the effectivity of the manager. So.
Or probably even the same microservices, right? To avoid the chaos, we need to come to a decent ratio where there are not too many cooks spoiling the broth in this case specifically, because of course for customer facing applications where there's a lot of UI involved, we may need more product managers. But in case it comes to a situation where there are a lot of heads clashing, we need to see how this is going to work. So I personally do not have a good number, but from both of you experienced, I assume anywhere between 1:6 or 1:8 works. So yeah.
Cool. I think I just want to, before I end the presentation, I just wanted to recommend a few books which I personally found useful. I found that, especially when it comes to teams, I found that The Manager's Path by Camille Fournier, which was really good book, and I highly recommend that. The other two books that I found really good was Will Larson's An Elegant Puzzle, which is by Strike Press. Again, a really good book on engineering management. And finally, Resilient Management by Lara Hogan. These are new books, and I found that interestingly, I think engineering management, and I think Julian also talked about performance management for engineers. I think these are really good books for engineers to grow into a managerial role, or even individual contributors to go into architect role, right? Because often we see that engineers feel that doing an architect role is easy, but it's not, because as an architect, having influencing decisions is actually influencing decisions and influencing the team without having direct reporting structure is actually is probably more harder than having a management hierarchy in place. Just the way humans work. And I think then there are the classics, some of which I've kind of mentioned. I feel that Mythical Man Month, I think it's about 35-40 years old almost. It was written on the IBM 360 by this person called Frederick Brooks. Great book. You would be surprised, how the lessons of 40 years back in building projects are still very relevant. And there's and once you actually read it, you'll see that some of those things that you can even relate to. Then the other one that I really liked was Peopleware by Tom DeMarco and Timothy Lister, which focuses on how to make teams more productive and what are the kind of pathologies, right? It focuses on that, or the things that can go wrong with teams. And then there's a classic by former CEO of Intel and Andy Grove, High Output Management, which is an excellent book, a very practical book on management that I found. Yeah, I think with that, I'll stop the presentation, and I talked about the next presentation also, which is on Azure DevOps. So if you want to learn more about DevOps practices, whether it is like branching strategies, deployment patterns, building out environments, and again tying it all together, for security as well, I would suggest that you can take up the next. You can take up sign up for the next webinar, and I think we can post a link to that in the chat. Any final thoughts on the what we have covered so far? We just have about 2-3 minutes, so I ask you to keep it brief, Arnold and Chandni, on what we have talked.
I'm good. Just focus on customer needs above all else, because that's where what we are here for. Without the customers, any startup or any business is nothing. So if you focus on that, then you have your guidepost in terms of where to go.
Chandni?
Yeah, I think focus on your team's expectations as you build the product, and give them the maximum exposure with respect to technology. Hear them out, hear out their ideas, and take as much of tech industry knowledge that we can from the experts. And as Arnold mentioned, the product, of course, we need to understand the addressable market and actually build what is the need for the businesses. So yeah, that's the key takeaway.
Nice. I think that is a great note to end on. I like how Arnold focused on the external world in terms of customers, and Chandni talked, about the internal world, which was two stakeholders. And this was not choreographed. This was not what we talked earlier. It just came out very nicely, and that's a great note to end on. With that, we'll kind of end this webinar. And, I think there should be a poll that you will be able to fill on before we end this. Yeah, Kabir, do you want to add anything?
No, thank you, Vinayak. And thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you, everyone, and hope to see you at the next webinar. Thanks, Chandni, and thanks Arnold for your participation. Great points, and really enjoyed the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you also.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Have a good day.